Welcome to Data Myths Podcast with your hosts, Brian and Melinda Gagnon.
So, a little about us. I'm interested in how tech helps us improve our lives. I have 20 years experience in digital communications. I'm an ex-Googler and now help launch new companies and products.
And I've spent 20 plus years evangelizing tech at some of the world's largest companies. Whether you're a dataphile or a dataphobe, we have something for you on this podcast. So get ready. Let's go.
Good morning, Brian.
Hey, how's it going? Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. Whew, it's been quite a week.
We rarely do these on Friday. I'm interested to give this a try. Maybe it will be better.
Now that you mention it, it's our first Friday podcast.
Nice. We're
breaking new ground. It's revolutionary every time.
Playing a little hooky this morning. So what are we going to talk about?
This is not hooky. BTW. This is on. We are on right now.
Nice.
This Friday morning, we're thinking about the evolution of web development.
And
right?
the internet, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, I think a lot of people might say, oh, well, that's kind of maybe that's a boring thing to think about. And of course, we would beg to differ.
Nice. Well, so let's start off, where do we want to start off with? History? Do we want to start off with kind of the evolution?
Well,
and we don't want to lose people.
Let's talk about why it's not boring. All right. So I just to kind of undercut what this is. It's not boring. It's actually really fascinating because so much has happened in the last 30 years. I mean, we all know that, right? And sometimes it's hard to really conceptualize what happened unless you look at an example within this vast technological revolution that's happened since the internet was launched, let's say.
Well, and let's put a bow on it a little bit. So basically the internet was born in the 60s and through the 70s with ARPANET and all of that, it kind of evolved, right? And that was the underpinnings. That was routing, switching, networking, all of those things that get us to the point now where we have modems in our houses that speak to a router / firewall that speaks to Wi-Fi, right? That evolution really started in the 70s when devices started to get connected.
Well, and when we start thinking about the more, I guess, recent history of the last 30 years too, using web development as the example of how this emergence of technology really evolved over time, that's the example that's really interesting to look at. So that's why I think it's very interesting to kind of walk that through from a web development perspective to bring some of these examples to life of, wow, what happened that fundamentally changed how we communicate to one another, with one another, and also how we handle commerce, which is something we talked about a couple podcasts ago. This has changed how we live and how we communicate. And we can walk through all of that by kind of seeing how this changed over time. So you talked about how the internet started in the very, very early days. Shall we fast forward to the history that we lived through?
Yeah.
And walk down through that memory lane?
Yeah, that works.
So we both, we're all living in a fascinating time. And I think everyone says that throughout history, right? But we're really of that cusp generation who can remember what it was like when we didn't have a computer, when we didn't have internet, when we didn't have email or social networks. And we literally grew up through this very rapid evolution. And while some pretty incredible milestones were unfolding in history, we were kids and then obviously lived through the effects of that. So to go back to some of the most impactful moments in this history really is, who is credited for starting the internet, Sir Tim Berners-Lee.
Sorry, Al. It
Sorry, Al Gore.
wasn't you. Newsflash.
Yeah. So that was really almost 30 years ago.
And that in itself makes me feel a little old.
Well, it's wild when you really think about how much has changed in a relatively short period of time. And it's also when, we're not we're not old. I mean, right? We're not
No,
old.
hell no.
Okay, yeah, no, never. But we can remember before this stuff existed. So it's really wild.
So tell me about what were you doing in the second or third grade? Because that's my reference point of when I first saw and used a computer.
Oh, I don't think anything having to do with a computer was on my radar that early. It really, for me, was when I was in middle school. I would be certainly in a later adopter community and household. So,
Well, you had what, like 2 channels growing up
yeah,
on the TV?
I had one didn't have cable. We lived too far out into the sticks to have something as advanced as cable. So
Nice.
so when I was in school, we were making the transition from the the typing lab to the computer lab. So I do remember that when I got into middle school that I had a typing class, and let me tell you, learning about the home row keys served me very well.
Yeah.
But then when we got past that, then it was time to go to the computer lab, and I started learning HTML, which was great, and at the time quite cutting edge, for being in the 90s.
So in second grade for me, and I'm a few years older than you, 4 years older than you to be exact, I was just getting a Commodore 64. So I had a Commodore 64 at home. My dad worked at a college and brought home an early Mac and an early PC, 8088, super old. Everything was command prompt and DOS and all that.
And thinking back to that, what a fantastic opportunity.
Oh, I got
that's
totally
just
lucky.
amazing.
I mean, I credit some of that opportunity to my career because I learned so much. And so I was programming. I remember the first thing I wrote on Commodore 64, it was out of Byte magazine. It was a MIDI song or a MIDI sound. And so being able to program and make video things happen on the screen, which were like basically blobs, and audio come out of the computer was just mind-blowing to me. And so I started learning and reading everything in the manual about C64 BASIC and all of that. And then the next thing I know, when I was in the third grade, I went to a private school. They didn't have someone to teach computer stuff, and they bought or got granted a bunch of computers, and they happened to be Commodore 64s. So they started leaning on me to help them because I had one. And next thing you know, I'm teaching my my fellow students at the age of 10 or whatever you are in the third or fourth grade. Yeah. And so that was, I look back and I'm like, wow, that was quite an opportunity. And from there, I kind of continued along. So when I got to middle school or so, or high school, maybe my freshman year, I was already doing email because I was emailing people at University of Maine or MIT or wherever about how do we get faster internet? How do we connect our ISDN modem into your network? And all of these types of problems. So I was very early.
What year was that when you were starting to do those things, like emailing and trying to say, hey, how do I do this? How do I make this work better?
Probably 1992 or 3.
Okay, so let's zoom out into the world to see where you are in history. Okay. So basically, the World Wide Web, so our friend Tim Berners-Lee, who we just mentioned, that really started in 1991. So in 1990, Tim Berners-Lee wrote 3 absolutely fundamental technologies that still are the foundation of the web today. So most people will know, right? That's
Yeah.
HTML. Back then it was URI, so Uniform Resource Identifier, so the URL, and HTTP. That
Yeah.
was in 1990. And then, he started that at CERN. And then in 1991, they basically said, okay, we're going to open it up to other people. So you were doing things shortly after this just became available.
Yeah. For a web browser, I used something called Lynx on the Mac. It's actually one of the older web browsers. There were no images. It was all text. It took a long time for little pages to download. So that was very different than where we are today. And people everybody that was developing this stuff was a programmer. Today, not everybody that's developing a website is a programmer anymore. And I want to talk more about that because that's kind of the interesting evolution here.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So really with the first websites, you're saying it was text, and really, the hyperlink was the big feature of those early websites.
I remember the first time I started or I clicked or used a hyperlink, and I was like, wait a minute, what does this mean? Like, what just happened? I went to a different place.
Well, and to your point of like, wait, what's happening? I went to a different place. When you have this brand new way of presenting information, connecting information, publishing information, the first task at hand is to just educate people on what it does.
Yeah.
So, the technology really was so early that it was limited anyway. So it's almost like the technology wasn't ahead of that learning curve. But that's the first goal.
Yeah. Well, and the other piece to it is because the networks that supported the internet was so freaking slow,
You had time to think about what it was going to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Contemplate.
Yeah, and when I remember accidentally clicking on things, you'd see like a website that you're like, oh, this doesn't look like a well-designed website. And I accidentally clicked on something and it just started downloading, and there really wasn't a whole lot of hit the back button. You just had to wait. And it's like, oh my God, we're heading to the rhubarb. Let's just, let's just get it back on the road here. This is awful.
Right. So really, that's bringing us into what, like the early 90s that we have, more advanced HTML, right? So we have this text only, simple browser. It's super limited. And we have these just vertical, really text heavy pages with few graphics. It's very basic stuff.
Yeah. And so if you kind of fast forward a little bit, so let's go into mid 90s. Now people were starting to build websites. The whole advent of the webmaster, came about. I think that was a bunch of people that they couldn't be a cop and they weren't a lifeguard. So they were like, hey, let me have this authoritarian position.
And maybe they were Ghostbuster fans. We have the keymaster. Let's be a webmaster.
Yeah. So that started to evolve. And so people that were developing the stuff still had to be very technical. Almost everything was, what I call bare coded, right? So actually in the text and, in a text editor writing code. And so as a result of that, it was hard to find people that knew how to do that because you had to be an actual programmer. And then things like WYSIWYG started to come about. What
is Wiz? Oh, yes, you're about to go there.
Yeah,
what is WYSIWYG?
What you see is what you get, right? So
it's also a good term to describe you, Brian.
Yeah.
You're very WYSIWYG.
You married me, so you're stuck with what you see and what you get. So fast forwarding, now we've started to get into technologies that let you really build off of the visual and build a visual website. And I think that's when we really saw the explosion of websites, right?
Well, and to think about, what happened from a functionality and design perspective. So after we have these like kind of boring basic pages, and then we had the ability to create tables. So you have different sections of a website. And the kind of funny, interesting thing about it is that is really a layout that mimics print. It mimics a newspaper layout to now go from this vertically oriented page to a table format where you have different sections.
Well, and it's funny that you say that because now I'm replaying, my history. When I went to the University of Maine, 1996, and I'm actually, dates are starting to get fuzzy to me, but they would actually do stuff in Quark Express, which is a publishing tool.
Does Quark exist anymore? I remember doing stuff in Quark.
I'm guessing so. I mean, they had one of those pricing models like Adobe where you just give them your wallet and say like, here, hold this and take what you need. But, I digress. So everything was built on that column system, and everybody in the graphics side of things would say, make it look like this. And it was
They still do that.
They
Yes.
they still do that now. Yes, you're right. But it was really hard because we were translating from a world of, tables, columns, formatting that didn't have a whole lot of that formatting, or it was very difficult, and you have to put different table layouts together and actually use different, blank, clear columns to, kind of separate things. It wasn't very elegant.
Do you want to talk about the advent of the GUI?
Well, yeah, and so that we kind of touched upon it, right? Which is, as things like Adobe Dreamweaver and, there are a bunch of other ones where it was a little bit more WYSIWYG focused, where you could kind of code and then also see what that code was doing. It made it a lot easier.
Yeah.
Things like Fusion and Cold Fusion also, let you drag and drop, and some of the early CMS type of stuff. CMS is a content management system.
Thank you. I'm going to acronym police myself on the GUI comment. So graphical user interface. So basically incorporating images and graphics.
Pictures replacing typing. Yeah. So that became really important sort of in the evolution. And when I think back, the part that's really interesting to me is in 1996, the first website that I really built was for the computer connection at the University of Maine. It had e-commerce,
which we will totally put a link to.
Yeah. That will be in the show notes.
Pretty cool.
We found it on the Wayback Machine, and it's really, really humorous. I don't know if I'm embarrassed about it, but there was a section that I put that was the fun section. So all the different browsing tabs, and you could go to fun.
The bright pink tab catches your attention.
So that was good. But we had all of that stuff running on a Mac web server, which that in itself makes me chuckle. And we had a Mac database called PIMS. And we used PIMS for all of our inventory and point of sale. And then we linked that up to the web. And so I spent a ton of time taking pictures of products that probably didn't want their photo taken. And I just remember I went and I looked at the code, and it was really funny. I spent so much time getting stuff trying to line up and cutting little icons in Photoshop and getting them to all line up and be really, really, really small so that everything went really fast. And I just think I spent probably so much time working on that stuff early on, and little did I know, 30 years later, e-commerce is huge.
Oh, yeah. So just to put that into perspective too, zooming out again. So Amazon started in 1994.
And that is mind-blowing. Granted, they were in a very different space in 1994.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So And so let's kind of like pull it forward, right? So the thing I wanted to discuss today was really that evolution and like how do we get to where we are today, and what are some of the challenges that we have today with web development and app development for that matter, which is we have now gotten to the point where WYSIWYG and graphical design is really in the forefront. A lot of the coding is sort of in the background. And I think we're at the tipping point where you've got things like Squarespace, you've got things like Wix, you've got things like insert graphical web design tool, zero code web tool here.
Oh yeah. And to get to that point, we had, Flash, right? So Flash came onto the scene and allowed people to do, yeah.
I just made a
as you're
face.
gagging, yeah.
Let me make a face for you all.
So that's like late 90s, right? So this was like when people are getting super creative, and it's like this kind of technological breakthrough.
You know what I would say Flash was? Flash was all of the graphic artists like revolting against like programmers. And they were like, "Hey man, we need to be able to like make this thing like move and do all these things that you can't do over here with code. So we're going to like make, go off of Flash."
Yeah, it allowed like designers to bring in music, video, animation, all of that flashy stuff. And, essentially it was like pretty short-lived because it just like failed a lot.
Well, the irony is that I just had an old update that popped up before we started this podcast on this machine. And what's that doing? Why is it trying to update?
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah. But that, if you think about just that technology, that pushed, what we're talking about in terms of who is designing, who's creating, how the information is communicated. That really changed things. It really moved things in a very different direction. So then we have this intersection of, okay, we have our information built via HTML. We have these design elements that are clunky. They're not playing well, but man, we're loving it. So how do we bring this all together? And that's when we get the advent of CSS, right?
Right. Yeah, that's true. Skip that step.
So, I mean, and that really happened. We've got like social media starting to emerge. We've got just this like demand for, hey, we need flexibility,
You have to put a nickel in the jar.
What?
You used an acronym and you didn't say what it was.
Oh.
So Cascading Stylesheets.
Acronym, please.
Yeah. Cascading Stylesheets, basically a really elegant way to take formatting and have that flow through an entire website. So that if you type heading, basically that heading takes on a certain font, it might take on a certain size, but you could set that in one place and have that cascade through the whole website. Hence, Cascading Stylesheets. Makes
Ta-da.
sense. Yeah.
So, and from a user perspective, we talked about in the early days of the World Wide Web, we had to have these like blue hyperlinks because that's how people knew, oh, this is something I can click on to take me someplace else. Well, now we're to the point where people understand the web. And so we also have this design freedom because you no longer have to educate to that point to just help people navigate and find like what they're looking for. So these design elements no longer had to educate. They could just be more visual and more functional.
Well, and what I would say to that too is then you get things like frames. So frames didn't exist in the early HTML. Frames came about so that you could have multiple different experiences happening on a page. So you could have your, on the left-hand side, you could have your navigation, and then in the middle, the prime real estate, you could have that scrolling up and down, but still keep your nav bar over there. And that's sort of how they solved it. They basically, that was like web browser, inside of a web browser kind of screen going on.
Yeah, and it's
still do it today.
Well, and it's a matter of having a way of building and managing the different functions of your website. So essentially, the HTML is separating the content of your website from the presentation. The presentation is governed by CSS. So it now we have this wonderful marriage between, the two things, basically the content and the design.
Well, and one of the things, right, is as things like Squarespace and things like Wix has come about, you've got smaller businesses, able to sort of take that control and build their own website. And so right now, I think we're going through an evolution where there are a number of people that weren't a coder, weren't a graphic designer, really have no idea about maybe UX and UI, or if they do, it's from their own experience, not from their training. And so they're now saying, hey, I'm starting a business. You know what? I don't want to pay a couple $1,000 or $5,000, 10,000, whatever it is, to go get a website designed. I'm just going to do it myself. And so a lot more people are taking a crack at it. Well, what's happening is they don't understand. It's like doing math with a calculator and not sort of understanding, what actually is going on behind the scenes. So there's a lot of bad website being built right now as a result of these like GUI tools. But now there's sort of that resurgence where people are going back to, okay, I need to make a blog, or I need to make a website that makes sense and that has the right framework and that it's been built and architected correctly, but I need to be able to put content up there. What I really care about is the content. I don't necessarily care about how to build the menu in the way that I want and have it not look like the 100,000 other websites that did the same thing that I did, because there's a limited number of templates. So now insert content management, right? And content management systems have really been born to take that one step further, which is, hey, graphics and user experience and all of that have become complicated again, because it's a function of setting yourself away from everybody else and getting away from the crowd. So that's sort of where we are today, which is interesting.
Well, and the moniker that you'll hear from everybody who's marketing is, content is king. Well, yeah, it's really become a content game. Not to say that it's not a design game too, but it really is about content, and also a huge shift in how websites are developed and what they need to do is the mobile phone coming into play.
Yeah. Well, I want to actually, before I forget about it, let's step back for a second, because there's another thing that has changed in this whole revolution and evolution, which is search. Yeah. In 1996, if you asked anybody, what do you search or how do you find something? Almost everybody would probably have said Alta Vista, right? That was sort of the de facto.
And bookmarks were
very
important.
Yeah, they were very important. Today, I mean, I bookmark things, but I don't know how often I use the bookmarks because history just sort of shows up in the typing.
Yeah, Google is easier than bookmarks.
Yeah. And so if you fast forward, in 1996 or even 2000, there were so many different options for search. It was incredible. There was Excite, there was Alta Vista, there was, the list goes on. AOL had something. The list was huge of different ways that you could search, and they were all very different, and they weren't that sophisticated. They would show you literally everything on the internet that they crawled. There was no experience or personalization that you get today. And so that's...
Well, and then that's also part of, the content revolution, right? Like, to be discoverable, you have to have content. You need to rank organically.
And good content.
Yeah, because Google is smart now. It has to be original content. And that's a whole, another can of worms. But
well, and to that point, right? So what they started doing is, hey, they would just go crawl a website and look for words, And that took time. And so then we got to keywords and putting keywords in to help people find your website and your web pages. So then marketeers came about
And we said, ooh, more keywords? We can do more keywords. Enter keyword stuffing.
yeah, so now we're going to just put a million keywords in there and not put any content. So that was kind of a programmatic piece on the back end, and it wasn't really helping things. And so this has really been a cat and mouse game of getting out in front of everybody else. And if you think about it, that's really what all of this has become, is how do I differentiate myself from all of the other millions of websites out there? And it wasn't really like that in the beginning of the web, which is interesting to me because it was like, hey, I've got a research project or I've got a campus store, and it was very localized for the most part. It wasn't global. And now people are like, oh, hey, this is a great way to get out in front. It's free. It's free advertising. Let me create a website because it's free, right?
And that perception that it's free is actually really not true. I mean, of course, it takes time and money to create a website, to host a website, and if you want to do it well, it's actually quite an investment. And that's why, in the marketing and media world, we call it your owned asset, right? Because you own it, it's yours. And then there's an earned quality to it because you have to have something quality before you're ever discoverable via a search engine, for example. So there's an owned and earned quality here.
Well, and so if you think about it, and that's kind of where I was going with it, right? Which is over time, search engines have changed as web development has changed to meet the needs, right? And so early days, there really weren't keywords. There was just sort of, it was going out and crawling the whole mess, right? And then there started to become a lot of websites. And so then it was like, okay, now we need to keep up. How are we doing that? Let's put some indexing in place and let's start managing keywords. Then people said, hey, I want to get my stuff out there. Now you start keyword stuffing and basically doing those games. Now we get to, okay, now it's a content game because the search engines changed and now they're not just looking at keywords, they're looking at judicious use of words and sentences and grammar and all that.
And if it's
stuff.
original, if it's posted, 10 other places, they're going to, ding you for that. It's intelligent. It's actually looking for quality content.
Exactly. And so now we're in the backlink race wars, I guess, where people create content, they get people to link to the content, and then that actually rises to the top because it looks like, hey, there's a lot of interest from a lot of different known sources. And so that really hasn't quite gone away yet. That's still a pretty high importance score in the whole process of this.
And that's something I would love to dive into more, like how web crawlers work and why they were first created and all that, because it's super fascinating of how we've built technology to understand the internet. And just that in itself has evolved so drastically. But essentially, if we think of a web crawler or a robot, I'm using air quotes here, what that does is essentially follows links. And that's why you can think of it, you'll hear it called a spider, all these things, because it essentially follows. It follows, link after link, and sees how all these links connect back. And if you think of them as signposts, if I'm Google and I'm crawling the web, I'm going to assume that a website that has many signposts, other links, pointing to it is going to be more credible because it's like a vote. It's a vote of confidence.
Hey, you know what, though? So I drove cross country with my parents when I was a kid. And when we were getting to somewhere in Iowa, we started seeing signs. And the signs said, come to Wall Drug. 5-cent coffee. Come to Wall Drug. Best water on earth. Come to Wall Drug. Amazing. And so we drove, and those started getting increasingly more, pointed
Prevalent.
and prevalent as we got closer to Wall, South Dakota. And then we got there and we went in, and boy, wasn't it the crappiest place. I mean, it was a super tourist trap.
Well, the difference in your experience versus backlinking is, I mean, unless you're buying your backlinks, which is not not a great SEO practice, but you need to have another site say, yes, indeed, I think this is valuable information for me to have on my site and link to your site.
By the way, I'm making just a quick little line through the Wall Chamber of Commerce for sponsoring this podcast. I'm guessing we won't be getting that call.
Well, and to fast forward, we did a road trip to Yellowstone, 3 years ago, and those signs are still there. So yeah, it's going strong.
Well, and you just can't help. You still want to go, and you want to go back and be like, oh, maybe it's different.
The signs are cool.
It's not.
They're kitschy and cool. But yeah,
well, moving along.
Didn't stop. So, all right. So let's talk now about mobile. Okay. So mobile has shaken up our world in many different ways. And of course, how we design websites, how we view websites, this has been a huge, huge change. So in response to that, we have responsive design and how we build websites. So do you want to explain a little bit? Tell me about responsive design. What is it? How does it work?
Yeah, so basically all it is, it's leveraging off of CSS in a way where you're basically saying, here's an experience that I want someone to see. So if you take your browser and you open it all the way up to the widest extents of your desktop, that should look equally good as if you took the corner and, dragged it all the way down so that it was maybe a quarter of your desktop width, right? And so when you think about that, how does that happen? There's a couple different ways. One is by creating stuff that looks at that viewport correctly and uses the viewport so that what you see is a percentage. The other way is to kind of create breakpoints so that as you drag it down, when it gets to a place where it doesn't start to look good again, change the look and go to look 2, to not be too technical about it. And then when you get to the mobile size, do some other things. Maybe it's change the buttons. Maybe it's make the buttons bigger, make the graphics bigger, make everything in one column instead of 3 columns.
And for the user experience, what's awesome about that is they have one place to go. So, they're on their mobile phone, they're on their computer, they're on their tablet. It's one web property. It looks right. It does what it's supposed to do. It's not a disorienting or frustrating experience. And there are still plenty of companies now that have mobile sites.
Yeah, like mobile dot.
Yeah, like
whatever,
m.blah.com. And it's just oh my goodness. Don't do that to yourself.
That's some of these websites or some folks have thousands of pages, and to have to re-architect that all for mobile first, which Apple and Google and everybody else, they're really pushing mobile first. And when I look at this podcast and who downloads stuff, if there's 1,000 people that listen to an episode, 700 people were on the phone or more.
And with Google, they've, what has it been the last 2 years, maybe more, AMP, accelerated mobile pages, that they're really pushing. So yeah, it's design first for mobile. And when you think about the user design preference, it really is to the point of simplicity is our friend, and being clean in the design, being clear, being informative, certainly being entertaining, but you don't have to do that through flashy graphics and fancy buttons and stuff.
Melinda, all you need is that fun button in your nav bar. And
Yeah, that's all we.
yeah,
That's all
you
need.
you put the fun button in your nav bar, and like life's gonna get good on your website.
My, that should be on a t-shirt. We have a long list of things that need to be on a t-shirt.
Hey, so we're kind of wrapping up on the 45-minute mark here. So let's talk a little bit about where we are today, right? And so fast forward, a whole bunch of people have created sites on Wix and Squarespace and all of that. But now we're seeing a lot of them start to evolve and say, hey, I look like the store down the street. Web development is starting to be a resurgence. And some of that also comes into play where people are like, hey, I want to have chat on my website. Hey, I saw my competitor has chat. How do we do that? How do we, scale? Because we are showing a bunch of, things on there and we don't want to just pay to bring up multiple web servers or whatever. How does that happen? And so a lot of these things are happening behind the scenes now in a whole back-end revolution with things like Node.js and things like, just Kubernetes and all of these technologies that let you rapidly scale horizontally versus vertically.
So what do you mean by that, scaling horizontally versus vertically?
Okay, good question. I realize
Maybe that should be in another podcast.
I just got a little too technical probably. So scaling vertically would be in the olden days, right? And it's still valid. You would just buy a bigger web server. So you'd buy one that had more processors, more memory, faster storage, maybe more network cards. And so that is scaling vertically. That's scaling inside the same server, but just making it a bigger, beefier server. Scaling horizontally is, okay, I have web server 1, I have web server 2, I have web server 3, and so on and so forth. So that's scaling horizontally. And traditionally that's been challenging because you have to load balance out in front of all of those different components. So it gets increasingly complex. Well, there's now a lot of technology that's coming about that lets some of these applications and web applications scale seamlessly, but it still involves some coding, and it's not lickety split. Let's go to one of these WYSIWYGs and design a website and hope that I'm going to have all this functionality. It does take more than that.
Oh, absolutely. And that level of sophistication is so important. And I've been, quite frankly, stunned with how many companies that are really established. I mean, and of course, new companies are going to be there, but who really need help getting it right, because you just figure like, oh, this has been around for a while. Like we should have this down. And no, it's an area that needs a lot of attention and growing up, so to speak. But like for me, when I think about, okay, where are we, where we're going, fundamentally, it's about how are we using this technology in a way that is connecting with the user meaningfully and usefully. And we're at the point now where technology is no longer holding us back. It's the design and the intention that needs to kind of check us as creators of this content and these assets, because we can do whatever we want technologically, but should you? And make sure that you're, communicating your message in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, and in closing, I think I would like to say it's incredibly possible for anybody to build, a website and web design today. It's not 1992 or 1991. That's great. And what I would say is we're back to the fundamentals once again, though, which is if you want to stand out as a business or a person, you really have to do quite a bit of stuff in the background to make that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Brian. This is awesome. A walk through history and how web development has evolved. So it's a good little window into how far we've come in like 30 years.
Well, and I want to go more on this. There's so much more we could talk about. This was sort of like the surfacing, but thanks for your time today, and TGIF, everybody.
Yay, happy Friday. Thanks so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and share. And if you have a question or an idea that would be great for us to include on the next episode, we would love to hear from you. Just send us an email at hello@datamist.com. You can also send us a note on LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook. And finally, want to give a big thanks to our sponsors, Infonomic Data and Uprise Partners. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll catch you next time.